Well, let me just say thank you, and thank you for everybody who's on the call and who have so much interest in restoring land to prairies. And as was mentioned, my siblings and I did grow up on that property. We picked cotton and we did all that hard work that kids on farms did in the 50s and 60s. And of course, that was enough to convince us that it would be better to get a college education, and which we all did. And we went our own ways, uh, conducted our own professional careers, got older, our parents got older. And when they died, we got the farm back. And we decided that instead of trying to farm, we would restore the property as much as possible to the conditions that existed when the Europeans first arrived, if we could do that, and do that in honor of our parents' conservation ethic. So the discussion that we'll have today is going to look at that process. And I'll be the first to point out that the first thing we did was fail. We took about 10 acres and we prepared, excuse me, we prepared the soil like our parents did, planted in it like our parents did, and absolutely nothing happened. Then the second year we did the same thing. We bought this expensive seed and planted, and again, nothing happened. So we began to realize that maybe we just didn't know how to plant a prairie. So our step then was to seek some professional help. We discussed what we wanted to achieve with Chris Best. He's the state botanist for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And his advice to us was start small, learn how to raise native plants. He said, travel around Wilson and surrounding counties, the county roads, locate remnant stands of native prairie plants, collect some seeds, grow them in trays, which we did at our own homes, and then transplant these seedlings to a controlled place on the farm so we could learn how to restore these native plants. And we did that, and that was quite successful. That prepared us then to go into full-scale restoration. And when we look back at what we did, I would say the full-scale restoration really had three phases. There was the preparation of the land, and that's probably the most important, because farmland like ours had been row crop for well over a century, and the conditions that native plants needed simply no longer existed. So we had to get back to that just a little bit. And then there was the planting phase, the planting events, and then of course maintenance, which will continue in perpetuity to maintain the prairie. And once we had plants in place, we wanted much more than plants. We wanted the wildlife to return. So we engaged then in some wildlife recovery projects. So in a nutshell, this was our process. We'll go through these step at a time. This was our starting point. It basically is a postage stamp floating in an ocean of thousands and thousands of acres of row crop farmland, pasture land, grazing, and so forth. It's 200 acres. And if you can see my cursor, there, of those 200 acres, there were 30 acres of what we called pasture land. Well, as we got into this and we talked with experts on this material a bit more, they call these riparian forests. Well, we didn't know that. We have 30 acres of forest and 170 acres of row cropped farmland. Now, the farmland really had three different types, meaning three different challenges for the preparation stage. One area of the farm had coastal Bermuda, and if you've ever tried to kill coastal Bermuda, you know how difficult that is. The second type of land was this long brown strip here, which our parents used. They grew grazers in there, different kinds of grasses. They ran cattle on it, made hay, and so forth. So that represented a different challenge to restore. And then all the rest of this gray area was row cropped for actually many decades. So this was our starting point. The first step we were advised to do is look for remnant stands of native plants. Go to old cemeteries. So we found some of the oldest cemeteries we could find in Wilson and surrounding counties. find abandoned railroad rights of way, old river crossings, abandoned bridges, and so forth, and look for your native plants in those areas. We did that. And you've got to remember, we had been away from agriculture basically for a few decades, so we didn't know what these plants were that we saw growing. So we would take pictures like this one, and pictures of grasses, pictures of forbs. Sometimes we had to take pictures of the seed heads themselves, and we sent these to Chris Best, and he would tell us what we had found, whether they were plants that we wanted or plants that we needed to avoid. And we watched the plants, and when they made seed, we'd collect the seeds, and then we grew those seeds in trays at our homes. This was a very interesting and I'd say exciting part of this process, because we were learning a lot. We were learning how few native plants there were and how hard you had to look to find some. And you typically found them where humans did not have a lot of impact. So here we were now growing these seeds that we had found in trays, and then we took them to the farm. And one of the things we learned in those first 2 years is that if we planted native seeds in a field that had been row cropped for over a century, the seed bank of undesirable plants is so immense that the native seeds did not have a chance. And that was what we observed. Actually, in 2 years, we never saw a native plant that we could identify in those 10 acres. So we prepared the old cow pen here. That's what this was our old cow pen. We disked it several times. We would disk it when it rained. The weeds would come up by the thousands, and we disk it again, rain, and another disc. So we depleted the seed bank of undesirable seeds in this area. And then we laid these weed barriers, this plastic weed barrier. Underneath the weed barrier, if you can see here in the middle at the bottom is a tube. We put drip lines in underneath the weed barrier, and then we planted our seedlings through the weed barrier. And we were doing everything we needed to do to protect those native plants and give them a chance. And this made us really successful. I mean, we had grasses and forbs and wildflowers from seeds that we collected from remnant stands of native plants throughout the county. And these plants, of course, made seeds. We bought some books on how to sort them, built us some screens like these. We're able to sift the seeds, and we began then preparing quite an inventory of seeds, native plant seeds that were not available commercially. So this was our first effort after having failed for a couple of years. And we felt comfortable then to go into full scale restoration, which are the three, which I believe now we would say had 3 stages: the preparation, planting, and the maintenance stage. For the preparation now, referring back to that aerial photograph of our place that I showed you, I mentioned there were 3 kinds of fields. There was Bermuda grass, pasture grass, and the row crop fields. The Bermuda grass was probably the most difficult to prepare because we had to kill that Bermuda grass. And what we were advised to do was graze it heavily for nearly a year into the hot summer. And then when the grass was weakened, we sprayed it with glyphosate. When we got a shower and the grass that didn't get killed greened out, we'd spray it again. Well, we did that cycle 3 times that summer in preparation for a September planting. The pasture grass field required different types of different preparation. It was loaded with a huge invasive seed bank. So the experts advised us that we simply allow the renter who was renting all the rest of the place to have those acres rent free for 3 years while he planted Roundup Ready corn and maize. And what he'd been doing for about 10 years is planting these genetically modified plants and then spraying several times a year with Roundup. So he killed everything. In fact, that's one of the reasons we wanted to stop that, because the monoculture left really a dead piece of property. The birds and everything we had seen in our youth were gone. And I've got to admit to you, we were impatient. We didn't wait 3 years. We only did this for 2 years and planted. 3 years would have been better, but 2 years worked. And we planted right into the stubble, corn stubble in his last year of harvest. Now the row cropped fields were the easiest to plant. All we had to do was nothing, especially don't disturb the soil, because any kind of tilling would have brought up seeds and enabled them to sprout. Instead, all we did was planted directly into the corn and maize stubble in the last year of harvest. So this was the preparation of the fields. The goal of each field before planting was to look like this, just sterile, nothing growing there, hopefully a diminished seed bank of undesirable seeds. And then we planted directly into these stubble without stirring the soil in any way. And that brings us to the planting events. The planting was expensive and we needed help with that. So we went to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, and applied for a WIP grant, that's Wildlife Habitat Improvement Program grant, which was cost sharing. They paid for half the cost and we paid for half the cost of all the plantings. But along with that funding came the great advice we needed. They provided the seed mix, advice on time of year to planting, all this advice we needed on the preparation. And we went to Douglas King Seeds in San Antonio and purchased the seed. Now this is 10 years ago. And at that time, of that seed mix that was recommended, there were fewer than 15 species available commercially at that time. So we bought what we could, and then we added the seeds that we had made in our own seed increase plot to do the plantings. And of course, using ordinary planting equipment would not work. One has to use a no-till drill. Douglas King Seeds had that, and we rented that from them also. So over a 3-year period then, in 4 planting events, we planted all 170 acres in the seed mixes that were available in those 3 years. 2 of our plantings were in early May, 2 were in early September. Sometimes it was dry when we planted, sometimes wet, sometimes it rained shortly afterwards, sometimes it didn't rain at all. And each one of those sets of conditions provided a different outcome. And it's really interesting these days to walk across the prairie and see how it's different depending on how the initial year's conditions were. So here's one of the planting events, planting after the row crop renter's last harvest of corn. It just planted directly into the stubble. That's my brother Scott doing most of the planting. And here's a real interesting picture where Scott is checking to see if the planter is dropping seed. You can see his finger is flicking up dust. So this is a year after the hot summer. We were planting into dust. But it was a very lucky planting event because the next week, the rains, September rains started and we had a wet fall. And in wet conditions following planting, this is what we got. This is switchgrass, the clump grass that was in our seed mix, grew to a height of 9 feet in its second year of growth. In the planting areas where it did not rain at all for a long time, we got almost no switchgrass, but we got predominantly short grasses. So there's a lot of variety in this restored prairie. Now we move from those planting events to maintenance. Maintaining the prairie uses several management techniques. Perhaps the one that surprised us most was the invasive species that we had to control. This is a tremendous task, especially in the first few years after planting. And in our area, the invasive species were several introduced grasses, those old world blue stems, and then the woody species, bacchus, huisache, and mesquite. And let me check, see if I'm hoping y'all are hearing me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my phone was going off, so I was wondering if someone was trying to reach me. Okay. Another management technique is prescribed grazing. We're producing hay. We hope to use controlled burns, but right now we are in 3 years of tests of controlled burns under a plan written by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And we occasionally shred, and we've got bought a stalk cutter recently. So when we think the grass needs to be beat up a little bit like a herd of buffalo would do, we'll run that stalk cutter across it. So these are things we're experimenting with just to see what the outcome would be, see how much it helps or in fact we're hurting the prairie. Let's take a look at this field because it tells you a lot about invasive species control. This is a field that is in the spring, its third spring. So it has had 2 years of growth. You see all this nice, real low, short grasses in here, interspersed with medium height grasses. And over here, you see this tall clump grass. This is switchgrass. Way in the background, there's a lot of switchgrass, but all this green stuff in between is what we don't want. So it's in those first few years of restoration where there is some bare dirt here and there, there's always something that's going to be opportunistic, like this backrus. And that was our biggest problem initially. The backrus came up everywhere there was bare dirt, but it is very susceptible to treatments by 2,4-D. What we learned we could do was like in this case right here, very early spring, like I think this is probably March. We sprayed this with 2,4-D and it just kills it. If it gets away from us, we'll wait until later when it maybe gets 7 or 8 feet tall, shred it, and then when it greens out, hit it with 2,4-D, and that kills it. So the backrus was a problem for the first 3 years. After that, the prairie becomes robust enough, or at least ours did, and the cover by grass was so thick that there was not enough bare ground for this backrus to return. Another of the really and probably worst challenge and continuing challenge is weesatch. And thank God for volunteers, especially the Alamo Area Master Naturalist volunteers who have come out. And in the fall and early winter, when it is a good time to be cutting this small weesatch with loppers and then treating those stumps with remedy diesel mixture. When the weesatch gets a little bit bigger, we would cut it down with brush cutter like my sister Brenda is doing here, or a pole saw where we could reach under, cut the tree off at the ground, and then treat the stump with a remedy diesel mixture. And in 2019, I mean, the weesatch, there was so much of it, it just got away from us. And we had to hire a contractor with this device, and he'd pull up the trees by their roots and then stack them in piles. And that, by the way, became a good bird habitat. We had piles of wood out there on the prairie. So when we really kept at it and we were able to suppress the invasives, this is what we got. A great prairie with lots of variety in the small grass, short grasses, medium-sized grasses, and then clumps of the big switchgrass scattered around. Another management tool that we are using is prescribed grazing. And this has been facilitated by a grant from a GRIP grant, that's Grassland Restoration Incentive Program. And the first grant we got from them enabled us to build cross fencing. Will Newman helped us get this grant. He's now with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. But with that grant, we divided the property into a pie, 5 slices of pie, the central hub where the water is and the animals can come for minerals and protein blocks. Then these are our neighbors' cattle. We don't have any cattle. They're called cattle when they're on the neighbor's property, and they're called buffalo when they're on our property. And we're following NRCS guidelines to graze a section of the property heavily, graze it down to a certain height, take the cattle off and move them to another section or off the property completely. So we're doing all of this under the guidance of Natural Resource Conservation Service. Another management tool is to bale hay. You can imagine just how much hay these big tall grasses make, as well as the dense population of small grasses. And that hay is our revenue source. We need a revenue stream because one of our goals is to pass this property on to the next generation in a financially self-sustaining capacity. So we are really pretty much at that point right now. We're making enough hay sales to break even and pay restoration expenses. The whole management tool of fire is one we really want to be able to use, but we don't yet know if we can or not. So we've got a project underway, a test plan written by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Jamie Killian, who is our wildlife biologist for Wilson and Karnes counties. And we have, under her plan, we have set aside 4 test plots. One is 3 acres. Our first test burn was in 2019. That year we burned 1 acre in each of the 4 plots. In 2020, the plan called for burning that acre plus a second acre in each of the 4 plots. And this year, these are all summer burns, by the way. It's important that these be summer burns. So this summer, we will burn all 3 acres in all 4 test plots. And graduate students at the University of Texas at San Antonio are recording the recovery of plants. What we need to know is what recovers faster in our environment. Will it be the native plants that we don't want, or the native plants that we do want, or the invasive introduced plants that we don't want? So the jury is still out on that. The research project is still underway. Now, after going through the preparation, the planting, and we've got these management tools in place, along with that, we wanted wildlife to recover. So in able to finance that, we went to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, and we applied for a PFW grant, Partners for Fish and Wildlife. This is a grant that paid 50%, and we paid 50% of 4 projects. One was to construct 3 wildlife guzzlers. Another was to construct 3 burrowing owl roost sites. We built we planted a green tree pollinator fire break 50 feet wide around Prairie headquarters, and we planted 10 diversity plots. So these were the 4 plots funded in part by a PFW grant. And if you fast forward now to last year, after we've had several years of experience with prairie restoration, we're seeing the disappointing impact of introduced non-native seeds blowing onto our property. So we started out with pretty clean fields. These introduced grasses, KR bluestem, silky bluestem, and others, are blowing in from our neighbors' fields to the south. So we applied for a grant to plant a 100-foot wide windbreak. And I'll get into the details of each one of these projects. The first one was the wildlife guzzlers, 3 of them. This was an Eagle Scout project. The Scouts built a catchment being a roof that delivered water to a storage tank, which delivered water to the guzzler in the ground. And we learned very quickly that you build it and they will come. It's just amazing how the wildlife recovered. Quail had been gone for at least 10 years, and within 2 years, the quail population was back. Turkeys were back, many other kind of wildlife. Deer, which we did not have when we were kids, And of course, their population came back not because of our prairie, but for other reasons. But deer population is just really healthy living out here on this prairie. Uh, Foxes, coyotes, bobcats. This is the fourth year that our game cameras have photographed bobcat families, 2, 3, and we think one year there were 4 kittens raised at this particular guzzler. And we got kind of lucky this past August. Normally it's very hot and dry. We did get some rain followed in the early September by a deluge, which filled this pond up. And of course that brought the waterfowl back, and you can see this bobcat in here. It didn't take long for the bobcats to discover there might be some food out there on that water.
Do we have a question about the water guzzler stations? Were you filling the tanks up with like a hydro mulch or a tank in the bed of a pickup to draft water into the wildlife water guzzler?
No, they caught all their own rainwater. The Boy Scouts sized the storage tanks so that in dry season, there would be enough water there to get all the way through the summer. So that particular storage tank here is a 550-gallon storage tank. Now, the 2 other guzzlers that they built were connected by pipeline to a 3,000-gallon rainwater storage tank connected to our hay barn. So no water has been purchased or piped in. It's all rainwater collected.
Oh, nice. So that was a roof they were building.
Yes, exactly. That was a roof out there with a gutter, then the gutter delivered to that 550-gallon tank. Yeah. And then the second PFW project was to construct 3 burrowing owl roost sites. It also was an Eagle Scout project. And the Scouts made, there were 3 sites. Each site has 2 burrows. Each burrow has 2 entries. A burrow is made from a 55-gallon drum, half of a drum buried in the ground with 2 of these tubes connected to it coming to the surface to a point like this, into a brick. And again, you build it and they will come. The burrowing owls found these sites, but the sites were not as successful. And here's the reason for it. Owls weren't the only ones that liked these holes in the ground. Ground squirrels, rabbits, rats, mice, possums, skunks, armadillos liked going into these things. Snakes, snakes really loved going into here. And the problem we had is these animals would fill those tubes up with dirt, so the owls couldn't get in. And we could clean the tubes out, and sometimes overnight the animals would plug those holes up again. So the design was not working very well for owls, but it was working plenty well for other wildlife. And the bobcats and other predators knew it. So they would come to these at night, and our cameras would catch them trying to get something out of these burrowing owl roost sites. That led us to a different design, which we installed in late September of this year. This other design, we buried this is an 8-inch diameter pipe with a fixture put on the end of it. The size hole is 4.5 inches in diameter size so that burrowing owls can get in, but predators cannot. And we put that in at the end of September, and within 2 weeks, a burrowing owl had found one of these already. And this owl has been there, is still there. Yesterday, a day before yesterday, I was back there and I took some excellent pictures of him or her. And we have a game camera set about 5 yards in front of this, hoping to document when or if this owl has a mate. And then maybe this year we'll have some little ones at this site. The third PFW project was to plant a 50-foot wide green tree fire break around Prairie headquarters. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services designed it. They provided the list of plants that we should have. A company called L&L Growers in the Valley produced 2,300 seedlings of 15 different varieties for us. On planting day, we had 91 volunteers out there on the prairie from Wilson and surrounding county Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and 4-H clubs, and they planted 2,300 seedlings. 3 years later, we had a survival rate of 74%. Planting day looked like this, with young people scattered all over planting seedlings. The seedlings were about 8 to 12 inches tall. This photograph was taken in October of last year. 8 years later, these 1 foot tall seedlings are now 8 to 10 feet tall, and they are serving their intended purpose. If you look underneath these plants where my cursor is moving, you can see virtually no grass is growing. That's their purpose, so that when the prairie out here catches on fire, it will burn up to this green tree fire break, but runs out of fuel, so it cannot proceed further and burn down the headquarters buildings. And something else to notice is this trail right here. The buffalo, of course, walk making trails both along adjacent to this green tree fire break as well as throughout the prairie. And it's really interesting to be out there sometimes, and you can see quail running down these buffalo trails. The fourth PFW project was to construct 10 diversity plots, 5 with deer exclusion fencing and 5 unfenced. To achieve that, we needed to produce 6,000 seedlings, so we built 3 nursery tables, grew the seedlings, and then planted them in these diversity plots. So our tables look like this, where we grew our seedlings, much the same way we had done on a smaller scale at our own home several years earlier, and then planted the seedlings in the diversity plots. They made seed. The wind blew the seeds out, or birds carried the seeds out to populate the rest of the prairie with native forbs. Then fast forwarding to 2020, after we had learned just how much of a problem invasive plants were, we felt we really needed a windbreak along our south border. And there was good justification for that, because there was a strip along that fence line that had brush growing in it. And downwind from that brush, there just wasn't any invasive plants. So the brush was stopping wind-blown invasive seeds. So we applied for and got a GRIP grant to plant a 50-foot wide woody pollinator barrier and a 50-foot wide tallgrass barrier adjacent to it. This time, the woody pollinators that were available, we needed another 2,300 seedlings, but this in 2020, compared to 8 years earlier, when we got only 15 species were available. Last year, 23 species were available. So we are really excited about this pollinator windbreak, doing a whole bunch of things for us, including stopping the invasive seeds, windblown seeds. And the way we achieve these plantings of woody pollinators is we use a subsoiler, and we plow trenches 23 inches deep, making it easier to plant. And also it provides an easy pathway for these pollinators to send down taproots quickly and survive drought or dry periods that we know will happen sometime after planting. The plants arrive in cartons like this. So the first task is to randomly distribute them among other cartons so that the volunteers are planting randomly the plants that we purchased, and not all of one kind of plant in one area, and so forth. So on planting day this year, we had about 50 4-H club members and about 50 volunteers from master naturalists and other landowners in the area who are interested in doing the same thing. And we planted 2,300 more seedlings. Now that brings us to today. We are now at the point where we are preserving and sustaining that prairie. And to make sure this investment of ours, investment of agencies, and all the volunteers make sure those are preserved in perpetuity as we put the property under a conservation easement with Native Prairies Association of Texas back in 2013. So this will be preserved in perpetuity for generations. We are engaging the next generation because my siblings and I are not going to last forever, and somebody else is going to have to take care of the prairie. So we have started a San Antonio chapter of NPAT with some excellent members who really are spending time out there with us on the prairie. We've been conducting 2 all-day workshops a year. We missed last year because of COVID. We had to cancel our December 5th workshop with the Bay Area Bay Area Bird Society. I got the name a little bit wrong, and that's going to be rescheduled hopefully in April. We conduct a volunteer work day every 3rd Saturday of every month, and we conduct tours for other property owners who are interested in doing the same thing. And as I mentioned earlier, we've pretty much got the prairie at a financially self-sustaining condition. I've got just a couple more pictures here. This one is one of the workshops.
Don, can I interrupt you and ask a question related to your last couple of slides? You had mentioned that your property is under a Native Prairies Association of Texas conservation easement, but someone asked in the chat how you're able to receive grants and have scouts and other groups come out and volunteer. So I partially answered that in the chat, but I thought maybe you could go over how I think it's a combination of that conservation easement as well as being a private property owner, being able to apply for some of the federal grants. Could you address that?
Yes, applying for a federal grant, there's many of them available for property owners, privately owned properties. So that was not a problem. Sometimes getting volunteers was, especially with a master naturalist, but the fact that we had it under conservation easement and their investment in their volunteer work would be protected, we got over that hurdle. And even the recent grants we got them because the property is privately owned. I'm trying to think of, I think there's some volunteer work or donation type work that gets limited because we are a private owner and we are not a 501c3, I believe is what we need to be. So we're not that, and I believe that makes more difficult us getting certain types of donations, and donations would really be helpful. I'll admit to you, we got a check in January from the, now I'm thinking of the name of it, the Bear Audubon Society, to put in some bird projects. And we are a property owner a private owner that they donated that money to us. And I'm sure it's because they know that investment will be protected in perpetuity.
And also because it's a conservation easement and you make your property open to public tours and education. So that helps with getting volunteers because you're associated with Native Prairies Association. It
really does. There's no doubt about that. Everything we talk about, we say we are under a conservation easement with NPAT. Yeah, that makes a big difference.
Thank you.
Yes, you bet. This is one of the earliest workshops we had. There were 40 people came to this. It was conducted by NRCS on quail. When the population of quail got so high so fast, that attracted a lot of attention to the property. This was another one of our early projects. This one conducted by Native Prairies Association of Texas, and it was specifically on prairie restoration and some of the early successes that we had. And one sentence that has really stuck with me was what Chris Best at U.S. Fish and Wildlife said at the beginning. He said, "This restoration business takes a lot of patience. and you have to be willing to keep trying even after multiple failures. Well, that certainly is our case. We didn't succeed at everything. In fact, some of the earliest things we did were basically dismal failures, but we learned and we kept trying. And if you do, you'll be rewarded with a wildlife like this that returns, or some species that we didn't even have when we were kids. This picture was taken last week of green jays. We've had green jays now for 6 or 7 years on this prairie. So with that, let me conclude my discussion and turn it over to questions and answers, and point out that we conduct a third Saturday workday of every month. We schedule workshops twice a year, and we do provide landowner tours for folks who are interested in doing the same thing.